Hi there. I'm going to do a series of lectures here on the Tax Administration Act. This is a bit like pulling teeth. It's not the sort of stuff that's fun to study, but it's very important that taxpayers and SARS officials know their rights in terms of the Tax Administration Act. Tax disputes so often get out of hand because we simply haven't followed the basic procedures. Now, in 2011, they brought the Tax Administration Act along to protect both SARS officials and the taxpayer and set down a clear set of rules as to who's who in the zoo and how the whole system works. And it's actually in any business person's best interest to understand these rules and see how they work. So let's get on with it. And we're going to start off with the players in the game. Who are there? What are their powers? And what should they be obeying? So we start off with a little organogram of SARS and National Treasury. We have Parliament, which is the custodian of the Constitution. Parliament appoints the state president. And the state president then appoints both the SARS commissioner and, in his cabinet, the Minister of Finance. People get that wrong. The SARS commissioner is not appointed by the Minister of Finance. It's actually appointed by the President. He's appointing both of them. And this can lead to misunderstandings, but we don't need to have to get into that in this course of lectures. Then, the Minister of Finance is in charge of National Treasury. National Treasury looks at the financial needs of the country and it determines the taxes to be imposed to make the country work. The National Treasury then reports to the Portfolio Committee of Finance, and together they thrash out the income tax amendments and rates every year. That is then handed to the SARS Commissioner, and he then appoints two categories of officers. The senior tax officers, there are not many of them, they are the tax officers that have teeth at SARS, and then there are the rank and file SARS officials who don't have anything like the power that senior tax officers may enjoy. Then we have another character, he's called the tax ombud. He runs between the two. The tax ombud is appointed by the Minister of Finance, and he looks around SARS and what's going on there, and reports back to the Minister of Finance as to any shortfalls there may be within SARS, and any amendments to the tax acts that may be necessary. Those are then reported back to the Joint Standing Committee, and then that might actually result in a change in the law. So, then we go further into the Tax Administration Act and look at the SARS Commissioner himself. In terms of Section 6, he is appointed and he's given his general powers of being the Commissioner and how he can delegate. Very importantly, we then create the next category of SARS official, the senior tax officers, and the senior officials of SARS who are able to make the big decisions. Then come the tax officers, and a whole range of provisions which don't really need to concern the public that much about the powers of tax officials and how specific employees can do certain things, and the powers that are given to SARS officials in terms of public notices. Very importantly, and probably the only thing you take from this first bit, is that SARS officials, no matter what their level, have to avoid a conflict of interest. A SARS official can't audit his mate or his enemy. SARS official is given a duty that if they have had anything to do with the taxpayer at any time in the past, they must recluse themselves from that case. And the public are entitled to actually go to SARS where they feel aggrieved in this regard and say, I want somebody else to deal with my matters. But please, let's not get frivolous about it. Right, so there we have the officers. They are then required to all carry identity cards. In fact, that's the first thing that you ask for when you meet a SARS official, because it might be somebody masquerading as a SARS official. Please, this is one thing that you must take seriously. There is a tremendous amount of fraud pulled on SARS. There are people who masquerade as SARS officials, they try to bribe people. There's all sorts of stuff that goes on that. So the first step when you don't know a SARS official is ask him for his ID card. He won't take offense on that. simply show to you to get off on the right foot. Then we have the powers of decisions set out in Section 9. We have powers relating to SARS delegations and civil actions and court appearances, which the taxpayer does not really need to go into in so much detail. Then, when it comes to the identity cards, we must just stress that point. You may always ask a SARS official to identify themselves. Right, so then we go and we have a look at what does the Minister of Finance do. Well, he makes the laws through the Portfolio Committee and Parliament. He then appoints the Director General of National Treasury and the whole delegation structure within National Treasury, and that's how they determine the tax requirements of the country and the appropriate laws that are needed. There's a further action of the Minister of Finance. He has to appoint the tax ombud. The tax ombud is given a mandate in terms of Section 16 to go into SARS and have a look around and to report back as to what is going on. These powers are specifically regulated, and really you've got a position that the tax ombud is not in a position to override SARS. So the tax ombud can look at something and say, I disagree with SARS in this regard. Technically, SARS can say, well, we don't give a stuff. We're going to carry on with the way that we're going, because the ombud cannot make a binding ruling on SARS. He can only say there's a problem here. I'm going to refer it back through the Minister of Finance, get it back to the Standing Committee on Finance, and try and change the law. The tax ombud is given specific authority to look at matters within SARS on a very confidential basis. That's supposed to be a public protector of sorts. Then the tax ombud reports back to the Minister annually. That report is sent to the Joint Standing Committee of Finance, and again, it might change the laws. So when one looks at the players of the game, it's just establishing the rules and the powers within SARS. The taxpayer doesn't have a lot to do with that. It's just useful to know who's in the zoo. But it starts getting interesting in part 2, where we start to bring in the taxpayer's first requirements in terms of the Tax Administration Act. And that's the question of registration, the maintenance of records, and the submission of tax returns. It goes like this. Taxpayer registration. Now, we so often hear it in the pub. SARS has to find me. No, quite the contrary. In terms of the Tax Administration Act, you have to find SARS. It is your duty as a citizen, in terms of the Tax Administration Act, to apply for registration as a taxpayer, to fill in the forms, provide the supporting documentation, etc. SARS can refuse to register you as a taxpayer, but that doesn't very often happen. But that prerogative remains with SARS. SARS can also ask for all sorts of other information, including biometric information. That could be something like a retina scan. That might come up in the VAT system. Again, SARS is very conscious of who it wants to be a taxpayer. They don't want to over-regulate taxes. They don't want to have small employees earning sub 250,000 Rand a year putting in tax returns. They also don't want to invite people to register for tax when there's clearly a potential for that person to defraud SARS. But in any case, it's your obligation as a citizen in terms of the Tax Administration Act to apply. So you will communicate all of this information to SARS within 21 days of being required to do so. You'll give them all their information, your banking details, etc. Basically anything that they want. You are also required to keep SARS informed of any change of address. Again, a fresh form has to be sent into SARS. Some people leave this until they submit their annual tax return, and there's no real damage done in that. What you've got to watch out for there is that if you run from SARS on an ongoing basis, that can actually be a breach of the Tax Administration Act and could actually potentially lead to a criminal charge or a fine. Now it comes to submission of tax returns. So we have given the SARS the right to ask people to submit tax returns. Now, really what happens with this is that once a year you have an announcement and it calls on all parties to submit various types of returns. These are not only the returns of individual taxpayers, they can also be returns of, for example, employers, VAT vendors, and there can even be third-party returns where SARS requires information from people, not necessarily tax from those people. So there can be other returns required in terms of Section 27, and we can also call on people who completed returns to make statements as to the amount of work that they've actually done on a return. So the system works on the basis that SARS will make a public announcement. Tax returns are due normally on the 1st of July every year, and then it's up to the taxpayer to then get on with submitting the return. Most of us do that through e-filing today. In fact, manual returns are down to less than 1% of the total returns, but very importantly, the emphasis is on the taxpayer to submit the return. It is also the obligation of the taxpayer to keep proper books and records. The Act itself is not overly prescriptive in this regard. It simply says in Section 30, you will keep your books and records in their original form, and that may be in electronic form as well. But very importantly, in Section 29, it says that you will maintain books and records for 5 years after the submission of your tax return. Now, that is incredibly important because you have that obligation. You're supposed to keep that information ready and accessible for SARS for inspection. So what you mustn't do is simply say, I've rendered the return, throw away all the bits of paper, let the dog eat them, and they'll be all right. Well, SARS can come along later and say, go away and reconstruct those returns, and that might be a very expensive exercise. SARS is then given the right to inspect your records. So they say you must keep your records open for SARS to come along and determine your compliance with the Act, or for inspection or audit purposes. So it must be kept available, and the retention period can actually be extended beyond 5 years. If you land in a tax dispute with SARS, or they're conducting an audit or criminal investigation, they can simply give you a message that you must keep your records available indefinitely. SARS may also require you to have your documents translated if they are not in one of the 11 official languages. That doesn't very often happen. So, what have we learnt in part 2? It is the taxpayer's job to get hold of SARS, register, and then keep sight out for your requirements to submit a return. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse. You, as a taxpayer, have a duty to submit the returns. That then kicks off the rest of the provisions in the Tax Administration Act. So in part 3, we look at SARS having a go at inspections, inquiries, and audits. This is where people get very, very nervous and they need to know their rights. It's very important when you look at this to understand the different types of SARS inquiries and what the rights of SARS inspectors are to come and ask for your information. These rights actually come from the Constitution because fundamentally we have a right to privacy, and SARS has to actually observe those constitutional rights and make sure that your right to privacy is not unduly impinged by the Tax Administration Act. So how does it work? Selection for inspection, verification, and audit. SARS can basically choose who they want to in terms of Section 40. They don't have to justify it to you. But there is a little caveat on that. If you think, and it quite often happens, that somebody is creating mischief on your behalf with SARS, you are entitled, in terms of the Promotion of Access to Information Act, to write to SARS and say, I would like information relating to this inquiry. Why have I been selected? I believe that there's something untoward here. And SARS is then got to divulge their whole case against you before they can ask for anything further. Now, some taxpayers have used this as a delaying tactic. I wouldn't do that, it would simply hack SARS off. But if you think that there is commercial mischief, I would suggest that you get to a tax boffin who would then follow your rights in terms of Section 40. It can be an expensive exercise, only use it in extreme circumstances. Right, so then starts the first type of inspection. SARS officials may arrive without notice at your business and say that we have reasonable belief that there is a trade or an enterprise carried on at this business, and we would like to know the identity of the business, or the business owners, the companies, etc. And we would like to know if you are registered for tax and whether you are maintaining books and records. They may be able to enter your business, but they can't enter your home. So for those are running businesses from home, we've got a little dilemma. That doesn't mean, though, that you can suddenly go and say, well, I'll hide all my papers and cash and everything else in your bedroom, because then obviously you are using it for purposes of business. So that's not going to get you off the hook. The important thing about Section 45 is that once SARS has come along and asked you who you are and where are your records, they can't do anything further on that line of inspection. They can't suddenly start conducting an audit without making an announcement. They can come back later and give you notice, but that will be under separate provisions of the Tax Administration Act. Right, so now the next thing that happens is the request for relevant material. Now when you look at this, you've got to understand, SARS officials are not allowed out of their office to conduct on-site investigations without authority. We'll look at that authority later. But any SARS official can now start requesting information by way of a letter to the taxpayer. So they can then send out a letter, they can then send it to a specific taxpayer or to a group of taxpayers, and they can say, give us information. But that information must be limited to the records that the taxpayer would reasonably have available. On receipt of such a letter, it is your obligation to submit that information to SARS. A SARS senior official, in certain circumstances, may require that this information is put in under a solemn oath. Now, this is where one has to be a little bit careful. If one has misled SARS in terms of a solemn oath, then you would really be in for the high jump. It doesn't usually happen that, but it can happen. Right, a senior SARS official may also require information from taxpayers purely from the point of view that they're not looking to conduct an inquiry, they are trying to estimate their revenue collections. Right, next up comes production of the material by a person. So, once you've answered your query to SARS, you may then be requested by a senior SARS official to come in for an interview. And there you can be asked questions about the reasonable amount of information that you have submitted to SARS. And that's normally a friendly inquiry. They've got to be reasonably specific about what they're asking you, and they can't ask you questions that don't relate to your business. Now, that is a procedure. Also, it doesn't often happen that we get called into SARS to actually answer and explain. All queries at this stage are really just SARS assessing the situation. We haven't yet escalated the inquiry into a major audit. SARS may also at any time extend the period for submission of information if that is a reasonable request. SARS is also required to keep the taxpayer informed. Within 21 days of a taxpayer furnishing information, SARS must go back to them and say, I've come to some conclusions, or I'm satisfied with the explanations that you're giving. What SARS is not supposed to do is leave the taxpayer out there worrying about, is this inquiry coming back or not? They're not allowed to leave their files for a year, leaving the taxpayer in suspense. The taxpayer may waive that right. Now we escalate it to the bigger audits. We're going up now from a verification letter of inquiry to a full-scale audit. Now, authorization is needed for this to happen. A senior SARS official may give written authorization for SARS officers to conduct a field investigation. In short, what you can say is that SARS officials are not allowed out of their offices unless they are carrying a letter of authority from a senior tax official. And that gives them the power to conduct an audit. And what they do then is that they take that letter and they still can't arrive at your business premises unannounced. They have to make an appointment, giving you at least 10 days notice that they are coming to conduct a field audit. And you are entitled to look at that and say, yes, they're coming and they're going to do their inquiry in normal business hours. And the audit letter will also indicate the scope of the audit and the initial basis for the audit. They're not just given carte blanche to carry on as they wish. So normally you would be notified, we are going to conduct a VAT audit or an employee's tax audit or an income tax audit. When they arrive with their letter, they can't just go after absolutely everything unless authorization is contained in the senior tax officer's initial letter. The taxpayer has the right within 5 business days to say, look, it's not convenient for me to have you guys around, please can we reschedule? And SARS has to take account of that. Some taxpayers try to use this to try and make the matter disappear. That doesn't really work. It used to in the old days maybe. But today, if you're going to change the date of appointment, have a very good reason for doing so, please. Otherwise, you're just starting off the audit on a bad foot. Right, so during the field audit, you are required to assist SARS officers. Now, you have to give them appropriate facilities. So you'd give them an office to work. You'd give them access to a photostat machine. And you would answer the questions that they have. You would also give them any relevant material that they might ask for. You would not obstruct them. You won't refuse them information. And you can even send them a bill for the cost of their photostats. But please don't make them too comfortable. You're not required to give them lunch every day, for example. That would be a bribe. So you simply give them an office and you say, right, what do you want? And you get out the photostat machine and you start getting them the information that they may require. Then, periodically and at the end of an audit, the SARS officials are required to give a report on the stage of completion of their audit and what their findings are with regard to the audit. In the profession, we call that obviously a letter of findings, and the taxpayer is generally given 21 days to respond to SARS with regard to their initial findings before a final decision is made with regard to raising an assessment. Now, it's very important that if you are given a letter of findings, that you respond to it. Otherwise, if you don't respond, SARS is simply going to proceed in raising a further income tax assessment, and then we will have to deal with it in a state of objection. That's a lot more work. If SARS is obviously wrong in its findings, tell them at an early stage so that we don't have to go through all the hassle of going through an objection procedure. SARS can also refer a matter for criminal investigation. Criminal investigations are not conducted by SARS. They are conducted by the National Prosecutions Authorities. This is when people get arrested for tax evasion. Now, in the old days, any SARS official could phone the police. Now, only a senior tax officer can refer a matter to the police for criminal investigation. They would hand over the relevant material to the National Prosecution Authorities, and then the National Prosecution Authority would decide whether they are going to go and actually press a criminal charge. All records have to be returned at the end of the day. Now, so let's summarize what we've learned. There can be a SARS information gathering exercise. They can go for whoever they want in terms of Section 40. But that is limited to, are you registered for tax and are you keeping proper books and records? The taxpayer would then respond, yes, I am, and that would be the end of that process. The next step up is a SARS written inquiry. That's a letter from SARS. They can select who they want. Any SARS official can write such a letter. You have to respond within 21 days. Then, if they want to interview you, then a senior tax officer has to authorize requesting an interview, and then an assessment decision is made. Finally, it escalates all the way up to a SARS field audit. That is where one has to have the senior tax officer's authorization before anything happens. Then we have to have the notice presented and an appointment made. Then they conduct the audit, and you have to help them along. Then they have to send you a letter of findings. You would respond to that, and then there would be the actual decision on the assessment. Now, those are the routine inquiries that we get with SARS. And generally, it doesn't go much further. There are further provisions, however, in the Tax Administration Act, where one looks at inquiry orders, where a SARS can appoint a judge to start an inquiry into a taxpayer. That very, very seldom happens, and what would happen there is you'd probably get an experienced tax counsel to help you if such an inquiry were to happen. This extends then into search and seizure. Notice in all the previous inquiries that we've looked at so far, SARS is not in a position to come along and grab things. They've got to make appointments. They can't take anything away during a field audit. They can only take copies of what is there. Now, in cases of serious tax evasion, and when taxpayers are not cooperating with SARS, they need to get a bit tougher. And this is where they want to have a surprise raid. Now, they don't want to give the secret away, but on the other hand, you don't want SARS officials arriving at businesses unannounced or in the middle of the night. So if they want to create a raid, they have to apply for a warrant to a magistrate. And that can only be done by a senior tax officer. He must apply to a judge and say, here is the case that I'm dealing with, this is why I need a warrant, and then the judge or magistrate would agree with him and furnish such a warrant. Then we get the warrant issued, and because the SARS officials have reasonable grounds that the taxpayer has failed to comply with the provisions of the Income Tax Act, and there is material that they are trying to get their hands on. And so then they will get the warrant issued, which would give them details of the alleged failure to comply, the name of the taxpayer to be investigated, the exact premises that they are going to have a search and seizure event on, the relevant material that they're looking for, and then SARS, once in possession of that warrant, must execute that warrant within 45 days, or they've got to go back to the judge or magistrate to get it extended. They can't hold a batch of warrants in their fist and say, I'm going to conduct search and seizure raids whenever I damn well feel like it. Then in carrying out the search, they must produce the warrant. And if there's no warrant, there's no access. Then they may open up the business and they can start seizing material and grabbing everything for further investigation. And they can basically search anything that is on the warrant. But they have to have a complete inventory of what they are taking. They take that information away, and we have to carry out the search in a good orderly fashion with reasonable decency. They can bring the police along if you're not cooperating. You may not obstruct the search and seizure raid, and the material will then be preserved until it is required for information. But you would be able to get access to that information. In certain very limited circumstances, a senior tax officer is allowed to search beyond the actual premises specified in the warrant. But only a senior tax officer can do that, and it's only in very limited circumstances. So hopefully you'll never get one of those cases in your life. A person also has the right to go to SARS after a search and seizure raid. and they say, I would like to examine and make copies of my books and records. And after the search and seizure raid is over and the investigations are conducted, well then SARS has got to return the documents back to the taxpayer so that they can carry on their business. So on search and seizure, really what we're saying is this. SARS must identify themselves. They must have a valid warrant in their possession. It's not more than 45 days old. They then would execute the search in terms of the warrant. They would take the information and they give you copies of whatever is there, and they must return the information back to you afterwards. Then once they've got that information, they would analyze it and make a decision as to how they are to proceed from there. So those are your rights in terms of inquiries with SARS. What we will now proceed to is SARS actually raising an income tax assessment. More later.